This is Seth David for schoolofbookkeeping.com, bringing to you another special screencast. This time we're talking about ZenPayroll, how to book payroll when the banking doesn't tie. Entering payroll can get very tricky, but it doesn't have to be. And as you can see on my screen, I've got ZenPayroll up, and as they point out, it's delightful payroll, and it is. They've got a beautiful interface, and it really does a great job of handling the whole payroll processing cycle in terms of the ease with which you can set up employees, you can even pay contractors, you can get into the payroll history and run all kinds of reports. The reporting area is great on this. So it's really easy to use ZenPayroll to run payroll and get the information that you need out of here. In fact, this is the first time with a payroll service like ZenPayroll where I'm even willing to skip having all the details in QuickBooks because it's so easy for me to get the details that I need out of ZenPayroll's reporting area. And that brings up my next point, which is how the information comes into QuickBooks. At the end of the day, the information will import seamlessly from ZenPayroll into QuickBooks Desktop or QuickBooks Online, and it'll come in exactly correct. You'll have the right gross payroll and you'll have the right payroll tax expense. However, the way they book the entry is a little different. It's a little different from what we're accustomed to in terms of the traditional way. Traditionally, we deal with the payroll liabilities, and it's a function of really the money flowing out of the gross payroll and into the liabilities, and then when the tax payment is made, it comes out of the liabilities and goes out together with the employer's share of the taxes in a single lump sum. So we're accustomed to seeing two entries whenever we run payroll, one for the net pay and one for the taxes. So the question is, how does ZenPayroll do this? Because they do it a little differently. So let's take a look. When I first go into the ZenPayroll's reporting area, I saw in the case of the sort of sample that I'm using for this payroll, I saw this breakdown here, right? So I have total employee direct deposits. This is my net pay. Here's my taxes, comes to the total $11,128 with 18 cents. So my expectation was that I should see, this is what's going to come out of the bank. That's what's going to get booked in QuickBooks when I import the payroll. But that isn't actually what happened. So what happens in QuickBooks is, and here it is, this is the entry as it gets imported from ZenPayroll. Notice I have a single entry that comes out of the bank account for the whole $11,128.18. Now normally this is going to go into your operating account. I'm going to explain in a minute why I have it in the payroll clearing. And in fact, this is the sort of crux of the problem, is because this entry comes into QuickBooks as a single amount for the total of the $11,128.18, I said, well, okay, then what happens on the banking side? Does the bank take one lump sum out on the banking side? And the answer is no. Here's what it looks like on the banking side. I do, in fact, have two separate payments that come out, one for the taxes, one for the net pay, again, adding up to the total. What can get really confusing, especially if your bookkeeper is a little detailed, is that we're getting it the same total, but we're getting there different ways. Here I'm taking the taxes, the total taxes, employer and employee withholdings, plus the net pay, and getting at the $11,128. Over here, what I've got is I've got the gross wages plus the taxes, and then minus, in this case, a deduction for a pension contribution that we have to deal with. So we're getting at the same total, but we're getting at it different ways. And where it creates a lot of confusion on reconciliation is, first of all, you're not going to reconcile because I have two entries coming out of the bank account that match up to a single entry that's in QuickBooks. So I have to reconcile that, and I start digging into the details, and I get very confused because I look at this and I'm like, well, these numbers don't tie, because then I'm looking in here and I'm thinking, okay, traditionally what I see is gross wages minus the liabilities gets me to the net. And that's not what I'm seeing here. Instead, I'm seeing gross wages plus employer taxes minus the deduction here, gets me to, and it's not the net, it's the total, well, it's the net amount that's deducted from the bank account, not the net payroll. So the question is, how do we deal with that? Well, what I decided to do is I decided to create a payroll clearing account. And what that does is as follows. The amount here comes into the payroll clearing. Then when I have the banking entry, I book them exactly as they come out of the bank account, but instead of booking them in the sort of normal detail, they just go against the payroll clearing because I've dealt with the details in the payroll clearing account. So here's my payment exactly as it's going to come out on the banking side, coming out of my operating account and going to payroll clearing. One for the net pay, one, of course, for the one for the taxes and one for the net pay. And notice these are coming into the payroll clearing over here so that I zero out perfectly. This way I'll be able to reconcile my bank account because I'll have these two entries in my bank account, which will exactly match these two entries here when I compare with the actual banking activity. And for that matter, when I do a download from my bank, it's going to match up. Done the way ZenPayroll brings it in, I won't match in my online banking downloads because, again, I have a single entry in QuickBooks that represents the total of two entries separately that came out of the bank account. So this is the workaround. Last thing to consider on this is if you run an S-Corp, let's say, and you have officer salaries, you need to carve those out. So the simple way, of course, is after this is all booked, you can book a journal entry and you can debit officer salaries and credit whatever account you're using for the actual gross payroll expense. So that would be in here. In this case, I just have payroll expenses wages. So this would get the credit for the amount of the officer salaries, and then I would debit officer salaries as a separate account. Or I could go in here and split this payment up further. But I would rather keep it clean. I'd rather keep this consistent with how it comes in from ZenPayroll and then book the entry separately. This way the trail is completely intact. This ties back to what came in from ZenPayroll, and then my journal entry shows very clearly that I'm carving out the officer's portion. So hopefully that makes sense. As always, if you have any questions, you can call or email me, Seth@schoolofbookkeeping.com. And one last thing, if you do want the detail of all the paychecks in QuickBooks, you can certainly do that. But now we're back to using still my payroll clearing account. Instead of having this payment booked this way, at that point you would not do the import from ZenPayroll, and you would enter all the activity from the individual paychecks here in this account. Then you would only have the net pay coming out of here. The taxes would have the traditional split between your employer share and then the amount that was taken out of the gross pay and put into the payroll liabilities would be included here in a split line so that the payroll liabilities would zero out. I've got a whole video on that if you want to learn what I call my detailed method of entering payroll. Sort of defeats the purpose of using ZenPayroll in some respects because the idea here is to simplify things. In all my years of doing this, I've never really needed to get at those details in terms of how much was taken out for federal withholding, state withholdings. Plus, you can always go back to the payroll service reporting area in order to get that information if you ever do really need it. As always, if you have any questions, email me, Seth@schoolofbookkeeping.com. I hope you're having an absolutely fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you on the web.